So the question that I was asking was about the question of over-representation and monopoly in democracy, the rule of the oligarchy. So as in the case of the Devasumod in Kerala, almost 80 to 90% are colonized and monopolized by the caste Hindus. They are already over-represented. Some 16% or 20% of the people, they are already over-represented. They consume from 60 to 80% of the public service and public education and academia, and even in private owned media, the oligarchy is a reality. So in this kind of a condition, grabbing more power, 10% more on economic criterion, which is an invalid criterion according to the constitutional framework of representation or reservations. How do you view this 103rd amendment that happened to the Constitution of India that tried to legalize this economic reservation, the economic weakness of the overrepresented caste Hindu groups or the forward groups? Forward itself, constitutionally, it means overrepresented. Backward means underrepresented, or having no representation at all. So how do you view this constitutional crisis and deadlock, which was also supported by the left from EMS actually initiated it in its 1958, not in the first, what you call the governance reform committee, he initiated that. And then in the Mandal Commission case, the Supreme Court also acknowledged that creamy layer kind of economic criterion. And now we have the economic reservation, EWS. How do you view this?
Actually, this whole question of reservation, whether one calls it affirmative action, positive discrimination, as we know, began in the rather noble impulse of addressing historical backwardness, that there were historically disadvantaged communities and so on. But with the functioning of a particular kind of democracy in India, a caste democracy, as Ambedkar put it, and as Ambedkar put it at the very beginning, even as he led the Constituent Assembly, drafted the Constitution, he was very clear that democracy as it was constituted in India was fragile, was going to work along the existing fault lines of a caste society, and therefore democracy itself was going to be a flawed enterprise. So it's important to remember this, that even as the Constitution of India is promulgated in 1950, in 1956 Ambedkar departs. He departs from the framework of a nominal democracy governed, conditioned and ruled by caste hierarchy to a space of rationality, equality and freedom, that is Buddhism. So what happens in India as a result of the caste democracy is that the principle of reservation then becomes the way in which the idea of caste inequality is addressed. It becomes a merely formal and procedural form of address. So what we are seeing now is the extension of that logic. So the idea here is that now we are reduced to the irony that Brahmins are asking for reservation, forward castes are asking for reservation, saying, look, we too are economically backward and so on, and that this must become the criteria, because that is the logic that was implanted at the very beginning, rather than the idea of social transformation, of social respect, social dignity, taking into fact that India is a violent, inegalitarian and hierarchical society, and that had to be resolved before we could arrive at any understanding of democracy. If you remember when Ambedkar wrote what Congress and Gandhi have done to the untouchables, a wonderful, in 1946, not for, but to the untouchables, where he makes a deep study. It's probably the first cephalological exercise. It's a study of elections, the use of money, the use of patronage and so on. And he says that what you have here is a mob arrayed against an army. So if you're thinking about the untouchables and the minorities of India, they're like a mob in front of a hugely organized army. So it's very clear how the victory will be resolved. So if one asks, should the question of reservation now be made economic, should it be extended to upper caste? The whole problem arose with a question of bad faith, that the question of the fundamental inequalities in India was addressed through the question of reservation rather than through the question of social transformation, which is also reflected in the histories of North India and South India. If you look at South India with the Dravidian movement, your Sahodharana Ayyappan, Narayana Guru, one could go on. Right? And whereas in North India, it has, particularly in UP, it has been the politics of reservation, not the politics of dignity. Right? And that's because of the way in which a caste democracy created a certain way of being within the newly independent nation, where the government became the means of address.